The International Criminal Court issues an arrest warrant for Russia's president over allegations of war crimes. The Kremlin says it's null and void. What might it all mean for Russia and for the war in Ukraine? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the show. I'm Sami Zeidan. President Vladimir Putin has been indicted by the International Criminal Court. Arrest warrants have been issued for him and Russia's Children's Commissioner, Lvovoa Belova. Well, they're accused of the war crime of illegally deporting children from Ukraine to Russia. Ukraine says 16,000 children have been removed from the country. Moscow says it's brought children to safety in Russia from war-ravaged areas or places under attack from Ukrainian forces. Russia doesn't recognize the court. The Kremlin says the warrants have no force.
The ICC is a puppet in the hands of the collective West, which is always willing to carry out pseudo-jurisdiction based on their orders.
Well, the ICC was set up 21 years ago and is based in The Hague. The court has tried and convicted people of war crimes, notably in Africa, the former Yugoslavia. Its jurisdiction is recognized by 123 countries, but not by Russia, China, the US and Israel, among others. A short time ago, I spoke to the ICC's president and asked him if he thought the warrants might ever be executed.
So, as you may know, the International Criminal Court has not their own enforcement mechanism. And in respect to the enforcement of the decision and judgments of the court needs to rely on the cooperation of states. So it's obviously the same with the arrest warrants. So after the arrest warrants have been issued, there are communication to all the 123 states parties, and the states have the legal obligation to cooperate fully with the court according to their own statute.
Which may never happen. According to analysts, they say there's a good chance that these arrest warrants will never be executed. What impact will it have if it is never executed? What would be the point, in your opinion, do you think?
I think it is a point already. Issuing the arrest warrants is the clear signal for the world that the action has consequences, that there is a legal mechanism of accountability, and the International Criminal Court as an independent and impartial institution is doing its job. Obviously, because of state parties has obligation to execute the arrest warrants of the ICC, then the warrant is a kind of sanction, because the person under arrest warrant cannot simply travel to all these countries, and this is 2/3 of the countries of the world.
Do you expect more arrest warrants, more indictments to be issued against Russian officials as investigations and allegations continue into a number of other incidents?
In my opinion, it is just a beginning of the case, but everything is in the hands of the Office of the Prosecutor.
I understand, but in your opinion, do you think we'll see more indictments of the Russian president as well?
It is also possible that the cases we already have, these two cases, will expand. Legally, the prosecutor is in the position to expand also for other allegations. As I said, it's not the end of the game. It's just a beginning.
How do you respond to allegations that the decision by the ICC is politicized, the decision specifically to go after Vladimir Putin?
No, it would be probably difficult to convince you that it is not. Obviously, as I said, we are an independent judicial institution, and if the prosecutor presents the evidence, present the material supporting his request to arrest certain persons, then judges simply impartially consider whether there is a ground to believe that these persons are perpetrators of the crimes under the statute. And I don't see here the space for the politicization. It is simply the judicial decision.
All right, this is the point by critics of the decision. They say human rights groups, well, they've documented violations by the Ukrainian side. Even the members of the UN Independent International Commission of Inquiry on Ukraine have said as much on the 23rd of September 2022. Why haven't we seen, the question is, indictments and arrest warrants for the Ukrainian side?
You know, we are working on the basis of the principle of complementarity. Means that the priority is obviously the national jurisdiction. The International Criminal Court steps in only if the national investigation and prosecution is not possible. In a case such a Ukrainian one, there's the cooperation between the ICC and the Office of the Prosecutor with the Ukrainian authorities, and they together make a decision what can and should be prosecuted by the national authorities before the international courts, and what must be charged before the International Criminal Court.
All right, let's bring in our guest now. We have joining us from Moscow, Sergei Markov, a former public spokesman for President Vladimir Putin. From The Hague, Toby Cadman, international human rights lawyer and international criminal court specialist. And from London, Denis Krivosheev, deputy regional director at Amnesty International's Eastern Europe and Central Asia Regional Office. Good to have you with us. If I could start with Toby, let's start with some basic facts of what we know. Who was taken, deported from Ukraine? How many? There's been a lot of different numbers and claims circulating.
Thank you. So, first of all, as we know, the existence of the arrest warrant has been made public, but the underlying details as to the numbers, as to the identity of the children, have not been made public, and is unlikely to be made public for some time. Obviously, there have been varying different accounts of tens, hundreds, thousands. Obviously, we don't know what is the evidence that the prosecutor has relied on, but certainly the pre-trial chamber that authorized the issuance of the arrest warrant and the publication of the existence of the arrest warrant are satisfied that there is a strong evidential basis for that warrant. So we have to assume, based on the principle that the ICC works on those most serious cases and a test of gravity, that the numbers are high. Again, we can't speculate, but we will know in the fullest of time if and when Vladimir Putin is arrested and faces trial.
All right, let me take that point to Sergei in Moscow. So we should assume, Toby said there, that there's strong evidentiary basis for the suggestion, the allegation that Russia engaged in what is not allowed according to international law. Why would Russia engage in such an activity to remove particularly children illegally in violation of the laws of war?
No violation of law. All this so-called base is just falsification and fake news, which is created by tools by this organization, which under the lost its independence and now under the control of the political elite of the Western countries, which conducted hybrid war against Russia and Ukraine and who support clear repressive regime in Ukraine. And in Russia, it's not so much angry about this decision of International Criminal Court, but more irony. They look like clowns, frankly speaking, because Russia, as you may know, moved a lot of people from the light zone, from those zones which is under the artillery shelling of the Ukrainian army, which is the control of the Kiev repressive regime, and few hundreds of children in Donbass have been killed by Ukrainian artillery. That's why Russia moved and saved these children when they move to the secure zone and put there to the special children's sanatoriums with a very good health condition. And their parents absolutely happy to do that. And there are lines among the parents who ask local officials to send their children to those sanatoriums to the safe zone.
Toby was shaking his head, I take it not in a lot of agreement. I'll give you a chance to come back in, Toby, for a quick comment on that before we go to Denis.
Well, unfortunately, it's the kind of rhetoric. It's the same narrative. It's the same response that we've heard many times. It becomes very personalized, just based on insults. It's not a mature engagement with the process, of course.
But Toby, if I could jump in, if a power says we want to move kids away from harm, from what according to the Russian narrative is Ukrainian shelling that is endangering children in the east of the country, that isn't a serious and mature allegation or point?
No, the response, I'm talking about the response, referring to it as clowns, right, as an illegitimate process. There needs to be proper engagement. Of course, the defense that Putin or any other Russian defendant will put on will be that, of course, they were moving those children to protect them from shelling, protect them from greater harm. That's a defense that they will put forward. Right. Of course, the prosecution satisfied that they have enough evidence to show that is not right. That is not what happened.
Right. All right. I want to bring Denis in. You, of course, look at things from the perspective of Amnesty International on the ground. What do we know, what the human rights groups know about those who were moved to Russia, given what Sergei said about some of them were happy to be removed? They wanted to get out of the line of fire. How does what you document stack up with that? How much of them or how many of them were ethnic Russians, although Ukrainians are ethnic Russians who may genuinely not wanted their kids to continue to live in a danger zone?
Sure. Well, let me first go to your first question. There's quite a lot of detail. I mean, it's not much, but enough detail known in answer to what are we dealing with. If you look at the statement which International Criminal Court prosecutor Mr. Khan released yesterday, he speaks that his team was reliant on deportation of at least hundreds of Ukrainian children to Russia. And he's speaking specifically of children who were in orphanages and children's institutions in Ukraine. So we're dealing with the fact that there is a considerable number of children who were in these institutions in Ukraine before Russian occupation. Some territories were liberated. This is the institutions that Mr. Khan's team was able to visit. Those children are not there. That's a fact. They were removed. What's significant here, they were removed not from harm's way, they were removed permanently. And some of Russia's policies, including things that Mr. Putin signed as president, point to a policy of their permanent removal, including facilitating the process of quick transferal of these children to Russian citizenship, and then enabling their quick adoption by Russian families. Now, on the facts, again, I'd like to stress two things. We know precious little. Detail on a lot of these children is missing. Figures may be disputed, but the actual fact of forcible removal of Ukrainian children by Russian forces into Russia is an established fact. And based on this, someone has to face justice, and now we know who it will be. For our part, you asked what Amnesty does and others. We are trying to follow what's happening on the ground. We're documenting quite a lot of such instances. Amnesty International published a report where it is documented forcible removal, deportation, and forcible transfer of lots of Ukrainian civilians into Russia or deeper into territories occupied, controlled by Russia. Right. And when we're dealing with this and that massive scale, we're talking of war crime and possibly of crime against humanity. And can I also respond to one point made by Mr. Markov?
Briefly, please, sir.
His response and Russian authorities' response points to voluntary transfer of lots of Ukrainian civilians into Russia. That's true, but we cannot conflate two facts. There's one thing when there are families who move to Russia and do so out of their own will. There's another when they do so against their will or don't have the choice to go into Ukraine. And third is unaccompanied children. And it's the unaccompanied children from institutions which were there and aren't now.
All right, that's a good point. I want to give Sergei a chance to come back in on that, particularly then, Sergei, the allegation amounts to the removal of unaccompanied children, particularly some of them may have been from orphanages where there is no parental consent, and they're removed, the allegation goes, to be settled not temporarily, but permanently, perhaps naturalized, settled into Russian families. That exceeds the sort of standard procedure of simply moving civilians out of harm's way, right, Sergei?
First of all, it's artificially created pattern model. First of all, between Russians and Ukrainians, there are no big difference. It's not as between French and British. It's something like between British and Scottish.
But that might be in the Russian perspective, sir, but obviously Ukrainians might have a different perspective.
No. Yeah, it's not Russian perspective. It's perspective of all historical documents during 1,000 years. Ukrainians, it's part of the big Russian people. That's why, by the way, our people call them Ukrainians. They're Ukrainians, but at the same time they're Russians. That's right. And those people who live in those regions which join now Russia, they speak Russian language 90%. They Russians according to any evaluations. And if these people have no parents, we must give new parents to those people. But at the same time, Russian government, if you know, respect family values very much. It's one of the reasons of criticism of the Western countries against Vladimir Putin, exactly for protection of by Russian government these family values and some kind of opposition to the ideology of LGBT glorification. And Russian government respect family values very much. That's why if during the war, some of the children lost their parents, and then these parents appear to be on the territory which is controlled by Kiev regime, there are a lot of cases when Russian government moved those children to the territory which is controlled by Kiev regime because their parents there. It's absolutely normal for us as for normal people.
Right.
And
right, yeah. We'll come back. We'll pick up on some of those points in a minute. Let me bring in Toby and ask this question. At the end of the day, will this warrant, practically speaking, ever be executed?
It's entirely possible that it could be executed. Obviously, whether Russia acknowledges the existence of the jurisdiction of the ICC is completely irrelevant. It still does have jurisdiction over crimes that have occurred in Ukraine. Now,
but Russia is unlikely to hand over its president. It's a nuclear-armed country. No, this isn't the former Yugoslavia, right? So, you know.
Yeah, certainly. And so it's unlikely that Putin will voluntarily surrender to the ICC, despite what the statements coming out that obviously he has a very strong defense to this, as Mr. Markov has already stated. But the fact of the matter is, if he travels outside of his borders, if he travels to a state that is also a member of the ICC, there is a risk that he could be handed over. And the next trip that he has planned is in August to go to South Africa for the BRICS summit. Now, it may well be, and South Africa has recently withdrawn its own withdrawal from the ICC. So the situation that happened with South Africa previously with al-Bashir from Sudan and failing to hand him over to the ICC, I don't think that they would make the same mistake twice. So whilst it may be considered theoretical, there is a risk of Vladimir Putin being arrested in another state and handed over to the ICC, where head of state immunity does not exist. So yes, there is a great possibility. It may take time. It's not going to happen immediately, but it will certainly impact on his ability to remain head of state.
All right. Let me put a question back to Denis now. Human rights groups, including Amnesty International, including the UN Independent International Commission of Inquiry for Ukraine, have documented what they call human rights violations by Ukrainian forces. The question that we often hear from the Russian perspective and narrative, or supporters of it, is why aren't we seeing any indictments? Why aren't we seeing any arrest warrants for the other side?
Well, I think the quick answer to that, history doesn't end here. In fact, history is being made by yesterday's decision. So we may very well see indictments facing the other side. But for now, given what's happening on the ground and the evidence we're receiving, this is perhaps one of the biggest, most appalling abuses which amounts to war crime. And we salute the ICC's decision to proceed with this warrant. By the way, in the statement which, in the press release which the International Criminal Court released, and in the statement by Mr. Khan, point is stressed, and we'll stress it too, this is not the only war crime for which indictments need to follow. With every day, the list of war crimes and other crimes under international law which are being documented, which are being tragically committed by Russian forces in Ukraine, is growing. And for all of those, time will come for someone to be indicted. But in answer to your question, if the other side commits war crimes, similarly, same process should apply. And to answer the question on what follows, I think there's one key point here. By releasing the information on the arrest warrant now, the ICC is sending a signal. Actions of this nature will have consequences. The unlawful transfer of involuntary transfer, deportation of Ukrainian civilians continues. That message should put, or at least serve as a break for those who are doing it, because the buck doesn't stop with Mr. Putin. Others will have to face, and perhaps these criminal orders will be less well executed or stopped now. That should be the first point. And then getting him to face the court and Ms. Lvovoa Belova.
Denis, do you really think that will happen, and that principle of justice, of accountability will be applied to all of those accused of war crimes, irrespective of how powerful they are in the world and any politics?
Well, that's certainly the principle on which we as a human rights movement insist, and we will work towards it.
Okay, let me bring in Sergei once again and shift the question to a point which you touched on earlier, sir. What impact is this going to have on the war, on diplomacy? Will it make negotiations harder right now?
No negotiation. It's just signal from European Union that it will be no negotiation, but only war and blood, and until last Ukrainian will die. It's we understand the signal. Same time, it will have not real influence on the diplomacy of Russia, but it will be influence this International Criminal Court. Frankly speaking, colleagues, recognize that clown style, stupid, absolutely irresponsible fake decision of this court.
Go ahead, Denis, but very briefly, Denis. Keep it very briefly.
Well, I mean, there's a lot to respond to, and the disrespectful nature of comments from Mr. Markov doesn't encourage me, but I'd like to say this nonetheless. Russia claims that 150 children died in Donetsk and territories around it, which Russia controlled since 2014. Now, leaving apart the reason why they died and why the conflict started and Russia's role in it, hundreds more children died as a result of Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine.
Right.
So if it started this to save children, well, it cost hundreds and hundreds of children's lives more.
You've made that point. I want to give Toby a quick final point. Briefly, what happens in the process? What's the possibility that an arrest warrant can be rescinded if there is some kind of political resolution?
It can, and I appreciate that's the question that you asked, but there's so much to answer to what Mr. Markov has just said, and I'm sorry if I don't deal with it. Of course, the arrest warrant could be withdrawn. It's unlikely, but if we just break apart what Mr. Markov has just said, that the war will carry on until every Ukrainian will die. Well, that's reminiscent of a genocidal language, and I think he needs to be very, very careful what kind of remarks he makes, particularly on a public broadcast. Again, it was Russia that invaded Ukraine. To say that Russia is abiding by all international treaties and Ukraine is not is just goes against everything that we know. This is a process that will continue. Whether we see Vladimir Putin in The Hague or not anytime soon, I can't say. But this process will continue. There has to be a process of justice and accountability. And those who have committed such heinous crimes must and will be held accountable for their actions. It's an aggression against Ukraine. And it's quite right that the arrest warrant has been issued. And I applaud the prosecutor for doing it, for having the bravery to do it.
Let's leave it there. I know there's a lot more that we can go on discussing, but let us thank very much our guests, Toby, Sergei, and Denis. And thank you too for watching. You can see the show again anytime by visiting our website, aljazeera.com. And for further discussion, head over to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. Also join the conversation on Twitter. Our handle there is @AJ Inside Story. From me, Sami Zeidan, and the whole team here. For now, it's goodbye.